I'm Peter Hoffman. I operate two restaurants in Manhattan, Back 40 on Avenue B and 12th Street, and Back 40 West in Soho, where I used to operate Savoy Restaurant for over 20 years. I started out just sort of as a passionate chef in search of good flavor and realized that that was best derived from buying from people that I knew that were making decisions in the field about taste and quality first rather than profit. They tended to be smaller producers. They tended to be local. Not all true of what our purveyors have evolved into, and it's been an amazing transformation of the food system over the last 25 years, and our businesses and the people we have access to, and how the marketplace or the availability has changed, and that's what I'll talk about a little bit. So today, the two restaurants are casually priced and casually set so that they're not high-end and high price, which sort of goes in the face of the myth that this is only food for the wealthy, for an elite group. Not to say that it's fast and cheap food, but it's accessible to a very broad audience.
So good morning, everybody. I'm a little bit troubled, given who I am and my background, that I'm only one of two people with a tie on in the room. When I came to the Columbia Business School, that is not something that I anticipated. So thank you for having me with you. My name is Hugh Hogan, and I'm the executive director of the North Star Fund. North Star is a community-based public foundation, community foundation, that supports grassroots groups leading the movement for equality, economic justice, and peace. Here in New York City in the 5 boroughs, and in some cases around the country. We have about 2,000 donors each year that help underwrite our work. We were founded by a group of kind of the progressive scions of New York's big families. Ann Rockefeller Roberts, FDR III, Toby Dench, one of our lead founders, his great-great-grandfather was W.R. Grace. And they had come through the social movements of the 60s and 70s and felt like their family's philanthropy was not going to meet a social change, never mind a grassroots social justice agenda. So they set up North Star 35 years ago to try and push philanthropy to be transformational and to think in social movements and be willing to fund people on the ground to have voice who don't usually get in rooms like this to talk about how to run a sustainable business or any kind of business. So I think the reason Derek asked me to be on the panel is I'm also co-founder of something called Community Food Funders, which is an attempt to organize funders across the asset classes in the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut metro region to be more savvy about investing in the transition to a sustainable regional to local food system. As probably a lot of us are aware, the rise of agro-industrial farming meant a hollowing out of the kind of sustainable farming infrastructure that we had around the country for a century. And so in many ways, the work that we do through Community Food Funders is trying to go back and take those pieces of the sustainable farming system that were already in place and think about what they need to look like today, and particularly bring in the third part of the triple bottom line of people and the question of social and racial equity, and understand that we could transform the regional food system to be more ecologically sound and sustainable and more economically robust by investing in local value-added businesses, creating distribution chains for the work that these folks do every day. But that wouldn't necessarily mean that it would be more equitable. So there's winners and losers in all of these processes. So our job at Community Food Funders is to really try and help people in philanthropy to think more deeply about the racial and social inequities that underlie so much of what we do in the economy each day here in New York City and around the region.
What's up? Thank you much. So I apologize. I'm Denckla. I am also tardy. All I can say is the moderator for these sort of things is usually dispensable, and I was sort of proving the rule with the case. And I will introduce myself, though, to the extent that it's impactful to this discussion. My lateness has to do, by the way, with an interesting thing where you turn off the FDR and they close the exit for some UN dignitary going by, and I had to sit there patiently. But thank God for City Bike, because even though I have a broken foot, I found one and made it across town, a little bit out of breath. So anyways, I'm really delighted to be here. I'm so glad to see such a crowded room and be here with such great businesses, many of whom I've had deep connections with over the years. I'm the chair of Slow Money NYC, which is a nonprofit networking organization, part of a national movement attempting to catalyze increased awareness of the need for investment in sustainable food and farming within their local communities. There's about 40 chapters worldwide, and it's a young movement. We're only about 4 years old, and already we've gathered around 900 people to our network and host an annual event called Food and Enterprise, which I hope you'll all check out in February of 2015. I also chair a related group that spun off of Slow Money called Foodshed Investors New York. It's a group of angel investors attempting to place funds in the same sort of sustainable food and farm businesses. And I see many of the members of Foodshed Investors here, so thank you all for being here. And then in addition, we created a networking group of organizations called the Northeast Foodshed Finance Alliance, of which many of the organizations from community food funders and others around the region attempting to make change in the food system got together to discuss how we can make impact together. And lastly, my current job is that I am the Investments and Partnerships Director for the National Young Farmers Coalition. So my work brings me deeply in connection with the investment side and the entrepreneurship side. And I myself have been an entrepreneur for many years on and off and founded several companies both in the food space and the green building space. So I hope that you've all read the charge of the panel, and if you haven't, I'll just review it just briefly, but that the food system is an enormous global enterprise, and Hugh's comments alluded to it pretty specifically, but many people aren't aware that the single largest industry responsible for greenhouse gas emissions is agriculture on the food system, which is pretty dramatic because you would think that it would be, cars or coal-fired power plants, which are close behind. But it has a massive harmful use of chemicals, synthetic fertilizers, and then the human impacts of the food system are just as severe in terms of unequal distribution of that food, and much of it being unhealthy for human consumption, giving rise to food-based illnesses of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease, which are responsible for a huge segment of the health costs of most countries. So our panel is going to explore how investing in small, local, sustainable food and farm business may provide a new model for changing the common economic wisdom, which has rewarded huge negative externalities in exchange for steep profits in the current industrial and global food system. And we investigate the role of private investment and philanthropy to help develop those business models where society and the economic indicators are not favorable towards making a change from business as usual. So my first question for the panel in that context is, do food businesses, in the context that I just said, or in the context of the economics of the food business, do they have a special responsibility, more so than other business, to be socially responsible and environmentally sensitive? And what are the challenges specific to the food businesses that you've seen either in operating food businesses or attempting to fund or invest in those businesses? So that would be my first question for anyone who'd like to answer that. I think all of you are qualified to jump in, so I'd love to hear your response. David?
I'm happy to start off. So the answer is a big yes, and for the simple reason of food safety. So this is all products that we're eating and directly impacts, a lot of things indirectly impact our lives. This directly impacts our life, and it's food safety as well as nutrition. So how are we providing nutrients to our internal systems, and from a food safety standpoint, Again, like there's so many diseases in the category we grow, leafy greens, Salmonella, E. coli, Listeria, huge issues. It's one of the categories with some of the highest outbreaks of food contamination. And this is also something you touched on, one of the, I think, the stresses of local food production. A lot of retailers and wholesalers have a tough time with small farmers because they can't meet food safety hurdles and food safety transparency and traceability. It's hard. You need a certain amount. You need a food safety professional on staff to kind of sell to these places. You need full software traceability. It's just there are economics at play that bring tension, and you need a lot of sophistication to meet these hurdles. So that's something as systems get better, what digital systems get better. There's economies of scale that bring these costs down, but right now it's tough, and that's one of the reasons at AeroFarms we decided we want to provide fresh food. At the same time, we need to have a certain scale to have all of the plumbing involved to sell to places like whether it's the big retailers, without mentioning names, but the big retailers as well as the food service, the wholesalers.
I would back up a little bit in sort of thinking about how I got to some of the place in my business of our commitment to sustainability and health and things like that, and to say that as a person, and a person who grew up in the 60s and 70s, I said, whatever task I take on, whatever work I'm involved in, I want to be thoughtful about my footprint on the planet. I didn't leave beer cans and paper when I went camping in the woods. I picked up what somebody else had left behind. And so how do you then take that into your professional work and say, what are we doing, in what impact are we having? And so that as a cook, as a chef, I was exposed originally to all the great products that were being flown in from France, and that was the pursuit. And yet I started to realize that wasn't necessarily what I wanted to do, and learning about food miles was something to think about. And again, I spoke a few moments ago about that there were other people, other like-minded people in the food chain who were making similar sets of decisions. That is, decisions about great taste or about locality or about scale that let them stay in touch with what they were doing. And so that we began to, it was amorphous, but it sort of, what we saw is that the scale of our business had to do with the scale of people that we were doing business with and what their scale was, right? I remember a long time ago that in interviewing some companies, I asked how many delivery trucks did they have, as a way of getting a sense of, how big are you? Your dollars doesn't matter. So are you looking at what's in your, on your shelves every day? Do you know what is coming in? So, so I happen to go into the restaurant business, but I think that that's a charge that we have. If we're, Derek said, we've got a climate change issue, we've got health issues in the nation or on the planet, and we have to look at that for each of ourselves in the businesses that we're in.
I would echo what Peter was saying, that when I started the business, I started because I loved ice cream, but I thought I can't. You consume and then you throw something away, right? Unless you get a cone, we could say, oh, we're only doing cones, so it's totally, you eat everything. There's nothing. We don't do napkins or anything, But that's ridiculous. So we looked at how do we minimize our footprint, basically, and it was because that's how we are as human beings. That's how we are as people in our own lives. And I see my responsibility as a business owner the same as my responsibility as a citizen, and I don't think that they are separate. So I think, in light of your introduction, Derek, yes, it definitely sounds like we have a heavier burden of responsibility in the food sector, but I think it's true. Anything that you're doing in business, at this point, we all gotta look out for the environment in whatever way we can, no matter what we're doing. And as far as challenges, I find that the local versus organic, finding ingredients that are local and being committed to local can be a challenge for someone who's making a product that uses sugar that isn't grown locally and cocoa and things that are just not available locally. And even with dairy, it can be a challenge to find. That's a constant challenge to find certified organic dairy. So we have challenges with, you can't be perfect. You can't just make a blanket rule and say, this is how everything's going to be. Everything has to meet these criteria. You just do your best. But the challenge is doing your best.
So I would say no, it's not anymore the responsibility of the food system to figure out our ecological and economic crises. Like every sector of the economy has to do that because the level of inequality that we see in the world and the kind of corporate welfare and global capitalism having this ability to sort of, everybody's trying to sell to a holding company, right? So you can cash out and then have a nice life in the Caribbean or up on a mountain in Montana. Like that is not going to serve the vast majority of people who are struggling to figure out where their next meal is going to come from, or if their kids are going to have a house over their head next week, or if the cops are going to beat them up when their kid goes to school tomorrow morning. So I think it's contingent on everybody. I think the exciting part of the food space is there is an opportunity to rethink regionally and locally because we used to do that. And also there's people understand that the kind of great parts of the artisanal good food movement, everybody should have access to that, right? Like we all want to see all people eat good, healthy foods, and right now there are certain neighborhoods that can't even access it because of income. Derek and I were involved with something yesterday, and a guy named Dennis Derrick, who runs the Corbin Hill Farm Project, which connects upstate farmers to transitional and supportive housing. This is homeless shelters, people with drug addiction who are in supported housing because of their health care needs, folks in poverty, food pantries in Brooklyn and the Bronx. Cited a stat that just stopped me in my tracks, which is the disposable income of the average black family in the United States is about $200 a year to be able to put toward healthier food. For the average white family, it's $23,000. So I think for me, the issue for all of you is a question of how broadly are you defining social? And does social have an equity piece and an ecological piece as you think about the kind of businesses you want to start and the ways that you're going to operate those businesses? The example that Peter cited about food safety is a fascinating issue because food safety is an issue in this country because of the industrial mode of production of big ag firms. It's not because of small producers and organic farms and sustainable farms and urban gardens. Most of those facilities never have those issues. So it's interesting that that's now turned on its head, and we were with the head of the Pennsylvania Association of Sustainable Agriculture yesterday. They're actually kind of turning some of that work on its head in D.C., and there's some exciting stuff happening in that food safety space around how to better support organic farming because the farm bill that we have is holding up the unsustainable system. So I would say, as you guys are thinking about these businesses, what are the gaps that you're going to fill in access to capital when there's a certain set of families in this country that have $200 to try and start businesses, and there's a different set of families that have $23,000 to start businesses, and what is your responsibility as a social entrepreneur to deal with that reality as you think about your business model?
That's great. Good start. Since I framed the issue in terms of local and regional, and Hugh brought us back to that, and all of the businesses here on the panel were invited because of their commitment to that. Could you all speak to how making a commitment to increasing the regional and local food economy's vibrancy is a way to show a commitment to a social justice or environmental remediation agenda. How does a regionally and locally focused business become a change agent in the social and environmental frame?
You're looking at me, and I, I do feel like I should jump in and start with that because I have 25 years of experience as an owner, really being part of that. And what's been interesting is that when we opened Savoy in 1990, there was the green market at Union Square. We bought from local farmers. There was no animal proteins available to us that was being raised in ways that matched sort of the value system that we were looking at. And of course, you know, and I can tell you that that's dramatically transformed in that time and in half of that time. And some of that comes about because we ourselves, but like-minded chefs and food buyers around the country were looking for products, and then supported people who had those ideas and went about it and came to us. So that we have, I won't say, directly as investors, but we've helped incubate a lot of small businesses that were committed to the same sets of values that we were. And so that availability that we see now, and for instance, even on a large scale, like Niman Ranch Pork, which is about an association of farmers, mostly through the Midwest, has grown at a scale and that we supported and now is widely available. So that it's about pursuing food with a face, that there's somebody and a set of values behind all of that, and supporting that with your dollars so that their business can thrive. And so that what that meant for us a lot of times is that I ran higher food cost percentages than what the industry norms are. And that meant then that the bottom line might be lower, more squeezed than what the industry norms are. And so that all of us have to sort of kick the habit of the percentages that get spun out of Wall Street and what venture capitalists are in search of, because there's no reason that you would ever invest in my business if it was just about percent return alone. And so that we're not, so that the reach that you have of supporting an economy, that's not just about local, because Jenny's right. I'm not a locavore, right? I love coffee and chocolate and vanilla and lemons, and those aren't from our region. But we have to, at the end of the day, we have to source in ways that are providing the total dining experience that somebody wants, but that that it reflects into businesses that have a set of values wherever they are located that are aligned with us.
What comes to mind to me is this theory of a set of brackets that was introduced to me by the woman that inspired us in Rwanda. She said she wanted to create a space within a small set of brackets where people could come and feel joy. There was no other space in their life where they could feel joy. So if we can just create this little ice cream shop where people are allowed to feel joy, then it's like this. But she said you can grow from there, and the brackets can get bigger the more people come, and experience gets bigger and people start to dream and people start to imagine their lives better and they can take the joy home and the brackets are growing and growing. And it's a theory of kind of displacement, that the bigger your brackets are, the smaller the space is outside the brackets, the bad stuff. And so I always feel, okay, well, you know, if someone's buying a pint of Blue Marble ice cream, that's a pint of conventional dairy they're not investing in. And so that's the impact. I mean, that's another way of looking at what you're saying. Like, it's not only that Nyman Ranch has grown, but that those are all customers that would have been buying an alternative that was less responsible. And so this is how we can all make an impact with our dollars that, as consumers as well as producers.
I guess I want to just focus in on that same question again for to the extent that we can refine it is, you know, why buy local? Why buy from a local business? Why buy from a local milk source? Like I know you've made a commitment to buy like all the cream from Maine Organic while they were still floating. I think though they maybe floated back up, right? But why buy local? Why should people buy local from you, and why should you buy local from others to the extent that you can? And is that a social and environmental commitment?
Well, I think about the fuel and the trucking and the just the gas emissions and that piece of it, and I also think of supporting. A lot of times, the local is also a smaller farm, so supporting that infrastructure. But I think we have an expert on local production, so I'm going to pass this to you.
Yeah, so there are many different answers to this. On the on one simple side, in produce, a lot of produce loses its nutritional value and it starts dying after you harvest it. So there's tremendous, in the category of leafy greens, there's tremendous spoilage throughout the value chain. Approximately 76% of what you seed doesn't get consumed. And if you follow the life of a seed, it's amazing between what the seed and the plant deals with, from pests to extreme weather to just the refrigerated trucks that weren't turned off, or a product that didn't make it into the cold chain soon enough. There's tremendous loss, and we've all experienced where we bought product and then it gets slimy and we just throw it out. So about 50% of what gets consumed, or maybe not 50, but like 40% of what gets consumed then gets tossed out. So when it's produced locally, then it becomes fresher, and this is a product that's not only fresher but nutritional density. Back to that again, it loses its nutritional density the longer it ages. On the cold chain and the trucks, a lot of our produce here in New York City comes through Hunts Point. The worst air quality in New York State is the South Bronx, where Hunts Point is, and a lot of it's due to idolized refrigerated trucks. It's not just in-time delivery and unload. You have a lot of those idolized trucks, and now there are some studies that shows like asthma and other related problems due to the poor air quality. At AeroFarms, I mean, we're from a local standpoint, we're trying to also deal with urban obesity, specifically childhood obesity. So we took our systems, our technology's modular. So we took a farming system and put it in a school in Newark, and in a place, not coincidentally, that also has big problems with food deserts. So in an area where there is a food desert, put a farm. In an area where a school, where the kids typically don't have access to farms, albeit an unconventional farm, we're still a farm. So we put the farm, it's now in its 4th year, in the cafeteria. So the kids, it's a K through 8th grade, the 6th graders run the farm. It's about the size of of this table. It feeds a school of 200 kids. They seed it, grow it, harvest the food, and it changes their eating habits. We grow products like chervil instead of arugula because they like sweet stuff, not peppery stuff, and they're starting to choose this instead of the fries. Additionally, depending on kind of the system of local production, in our category, these are, if you look at Salinas, San Joaquin Valley, where 95% of our greens are grown, this is transient workers that are paid minimum wage or below minimum wage. So we're able to pay typically on average about 40-50% above minimum wage and offer year-round employment. So it changes on the social side. And then this problem, though, is much bigger than local. So back to on the national side, 70% of the U.S.'s freshwater consumption goes to agriculture. About 70% of our freshwater contamination goes to agriculture. So I personally got in this business I was on the Global Agenda Council of Water Security for the World Economic Forum, And I realized if you want to solve water problems, you have to solve farming problems. And you look at the trends of urbanization, as well as how do we feed a planet just growing, coupled with urbanization. We really need a new paradigm to develop our food systems. For me, it's industrial food production locally.
I have one more thing to add to it, sorry, which is that it costs more to bring ingredients in from it. It costs more. So who pays for that? The consumer pays for that, and that goes into the food equity thing. I mean, I've also wanted to bring an organic product for as low a price as I could, while also still surviving as a business, which is extremely challenging. But if I pay more for something significantly to have it trucked in, that makes the product cost more and it becomes more elite. So that's a consideration as well.
I just want to. Each of these businesses have shown a commitment to a bottom line that's impacted by their social and environmental commitment. So there's an interesting thing going on with social entrepreneurs where it's sort of a hybrid between the usual conceptual severance that we have in our capital selves, or ourselves within a capital system, where you make your money here and damage the planet and do all sorts of horrible things, and then you give it there to fix it. And we were talking yesterday, Hugh and I, at this forum, and the philanthropic capital represents 1/1000th of 1% of the venture capital in the world. In other words, $600 trillion of venture capital and $600 billion of charitable capital. So that make it here and give there will never solve social problems. But having said that, these are businesses that are trying to move towards the middle. And with the challenges that are faced there, I wanted to put a question to Hugh is, from a philanthropic point of view, what do you see as the social or environmental good of funding local food and farm businesses?
I mean, from a critical social theory perspective, part of it is that the idea that trying to get politicians to do the right thing on a local basis is easier beyond the climate and environmental impacts. I don't know that that's always true, because there's some pretty reactionary local governments out there too, particularly in farming areas and in certain cities where people are starting new food businesses. So I really like the concept of joy that Jenny brought up, but joy, I think, comes with ownership, right, and control and power. So I think for all of you, it's about the high road practices that you're going to embrace or not embrace as you...
The what?
High road practices that you embrace or don't embrace. So Peter mentioned wages. I would bet my bottom dollar that none of the migrant workers that you're talking about in California and the Salinas Valley are making anything close to minimum wage, nor have access to reasonable health care, unless they happen to be connected to a community-based organization that provides those things where government can't or won't. So I think there's one group, I want to use an example of one of our grantees here in New York City called Brand Workers International. There's about 35,000 to 40,000 largely immigrant, many undocumented, working on small, fresh food businesses in Brooklyn and Queens. So it's Baba Ganoush, it's kosher cheese, it's a company called Wild Edibles, a tortilla maker in Williamsburg. And so Brand Workers got started because a young organizer was very frustrated with the larger labor unions in the food and retail space because their revenue model didn't fit these smaller shop floors. So these are entrepreneurs who got some access to capital and started these food businesses, because you can't do a lot of fresh, healthy food production. You can't do it in the maquiladoras or in India, put it on a boat and ship it here. It has to be done close to the wholesale and resale point, right? So this young guy, Daniel, went out and started organizing workers in those space, because what was happening is a lot of these businesses were forcing people to work 7 days. They weren't paying overtime. There was wage theft. White workers, lighter-skinned workers were brought in and promoted to middle-level management, senior management. Meanwhile, the immigrant workers that were actually at the heart of the business, who didn't have a piece of that business, didn't see their wages increase or their lives get better as a result of being employed by these folks. So I think what Brand Workers has had to do through an organizing and activist frame is demand that the city, because the city just took a note with Goldman Sachs, the Fresh Food Fund, it was supposed to be $20 million, and then these folks started organizing a policy campaign because they realized in the course of some training we were doing with them that they were talking about a few bad apples in the sector, and what they realized was they had to influence how capital flowed into fresh food processing in New York City. So I think that my point is that you will have choices about the kinds of practices and whether those practices are joyful and actually empower people, or recreate the model as capitalism currently exists, where there's one sort of heroic owner that, pulled themselves up by the bootstrap. You talk to people like Abigail Disney, one of my donors, and she's like, that's absolute bullshit. My grandfather was able to build Disney into what it is because the government put in roads and all this other infrastructure that made Disneyland work in California. So I think the point is that joy is about how you go about building your business model, and are you going to share part of the profits with your workers? Are you going to put people on a path to promotion based on their performance, not based on their cultural affinities or their racial background? I think for investors in the room, this whole question of patient capital, when you think in terms of a triple bottom line, it is different for low-income communities, poor white ethnic communities, low-income communities of colors in the city, communities of color in the city, immigrant communities. That what Peter talked about in like all the sophisticated ways he talked about the way Aero is building its infrastructure. That's amazing, but not all communities have access to that. So as you think about building your business, how are you partnering with some community-based organizations to actually float some more boats beyond your own in the ways that Peter talked about? I mean, that's really where the rubber meets the road. Are you creating a new form of accumulating capital that's actually just and sustainable and equitable? Or is it really about you growing the business to be able to sell it to a holding company? Because if it's ultimately that, even if it's local, it doesn't matter. It's feeding the beast that is creating the ecological and social crises that we have today.
So I'd say, first of all, I'm Peter.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
I got it
we
wrong.
All, no, it's all right.
David.
Everybody understood. But
My bad.
No, it's all right.
It's all 5 letters.
It is. It all works. The information is what matters. I want to sort of both underline what Hugh was saying, but sort of whether, take it, that part of the onus is not just the choices that all of you make, that all of us make in our businesses, and where that starts has to do with our own education. In this case, what we're talking about is how the food system actually works. And so I'm not just, as I said before, it's not just about local for me, and I don't think necessarily that's the value that matters the most. I mean, it's just like, so as Jenny said, if we shift our purchasing, our money out of one kind of conventional system into a better system, we have to know, for starters, what's wrong with the system. So how are animals being produced in this country? What is the effect of confined animal methods of raising pork doing to people's health, to water quality, and to be able to say that's not a narrative that I want to participate in, and so I'm making a different choice. But to begin with, we have to understand what the system is and how it's been operating, and so that part of my job as a chef, teacher to my cooks, but a owner talking to my waiters, to my customers, is to tell the story. You have to know what the story is, and there's a lot of ways in which people want to obfuscate what the story is, and they want to dilute what that truth is today, as it's become more marketable to say that you're green, but do you really act green, or do you just talk green? And so that we have a responsibility then as consumers, end users, but also wherever the business is looking at, to fully educate ourselves and our clients about what the story is about how the food is produced.
Can I say one other thing about the local quickly? So around this question of dairy, the other example that I forgot to mention, I could take you 50 minutes from here. There are dairy workers that are living in slavery. Chobani, the kind of taking off of Greek yogurt in our state is great. Unfortunately, there are farms that are basically have workers in slave wages. So I think it's also about this question of local. I think it is really important to problematize it, to make it more clear, because probably some of those farms are considered organic or sustainable, but they're not organic or sustainable from the perspective of their workers. So I think it is really important that we continue to have this discussion about local and its many implications. Because if it's just about environmental, again, that's not where the rubber meets the road. It's how employees are treated. 1 in 6 people work in the food system in this country. Industrial ag is driving people on meat processing lines to make more cuts in a shorter amount of time. And just the increase in repetitive injuries is astounding. Similarly, though, the Restaurant Association has fought every single effort of progressive organizers to try and deal with the tipped minimum wage and some of the other things that need to be reformed that will make our restaurant industry more sustainable and equitable from a worker's perspective. So the last thing I wanted to say is change doesn't happen because you guys run more thoughtful businesses. That's part of the equation. The other part of the equation is every year give as much as you can to the community-based institutions and organizing groups that change some of the underlying policy things that make it possible to even have this conversation about what the alternative is going to look like. Because if we don't ultimately, again, solve those underlying ecological and economic and social crises, you guys haven't done your job as thoughtful, progressive social entrepreneurs.
So building on a point that Hugh made, which is really important, and this is the intersection between the public-private sector and how it really, to solve some of these problems, the public sector, the policymakers, and the NGOs with the private community needs to come together. I was just in the hallway having a fun conversation with Ray Fissman, who's my former economics professor. And unfortunately, a lot of what I see is a lot of policy people and NGOs try and do the right thing, but they have their unintended consequences of their actions. And where they're trying to help is often in the middle of the value chain, where they're trying to have cheap food or for poor people. What they'll do, and to give a simple illustration, they'll push for having cheap water, for example. And what that happens with cheap water, if there's like a better way to pump water or a better way for water conservation, then you're not providing the economic incentives to the Silicon Valleys or the technologies to address a problem. So we want to make the problems we're trying to address really clear, and to avoid unintended consequences, it's easier to allow the free markets and the economics of those solutions go address the problems when you're working in the edges. So by the edges, I mean the retailers, the consumers, the restaurants. So they understand what behavior, like if it's water, if it's nutrition, if it's waste, whatever it is, what behavior to drive through the value chain and create a common language through the value chain. Or the other edge is the manufacturer, understanding there might be a big capital intensity to building a ice cream manufacturing facility or a farm facility or whatever it is. If you help on the edges, we're most likely to avoid the unintended consequences of kind of getting involved in the middle and what could happen there.
So I think one thing I is interesting about what Hugh mentions and what's coming up in the panel is that so many times we develop a tunnel vision or a siloed sensibility where we care about the local and then we forget about the worker. We care about the environment and we forget about the community. There's ways in which it's so hard to focus on the complexity of ideas that embrace so many different issues, and it's very challenging. So, but I would want to just note 2 recent books that underscore some of the points that Hugh made about labor in the Locavore, which is written about the challenges of local businesses to use labor that's not exploitative and the reality of that exploitation that does take place, and gives us a roadmap for how to change that. And Behind the Kitchen Door, which is about the low-wage status of restaurant workers, 2 books that have been very influential in kind of opening my eyes to those situations. But I want to talk a little bit about scale. Hugh mentioned it, and I want to follow up on that thread. I was at a recent panel with Net Impact, and there was a manager, Adam Kanzer from Domini Funds, who was asked why they didn't invest in alcohol businesses. What about the craft brewing movement? Someone asked him. And he said, we would invest in a small craft brewer, but the minute they went public, we feel that the pressures that they have to market inappropriately to children, to sell a poisonous controlled substance to people whose lives are destroyed by it and addicted to it, becomes problematic. It's no longer a personal relationship between the customer and the producer. It becomes this anonymous way of pushing a product and maximizing the bottom line without any care for the negative externalities. In other words, pursue the hockey stick and externalize all the costs to society and the environment. All of you face these questions of scale. A restaurant can be franchised. The production that you and contemplate for vegetables could be iterated ad nauseum. Of course, an ice cream company could go national, global, et cetera. I think people can buy Ben and Jerry's, for instance, in Abu Dhabi, through Unilever. How do you grapple with the issue of scale, and how do you deal with the way that it may inherently push you towards compromises in your values, or how do you resist scale so that you can maintain your values?
Happy to start. It starts as we've all founded businesses, so it starts with making it clear, and when framing the business, it's what our values are, and then taking it to what are our principles that we want to kind of push every day in the organization, and with that framework, writing what the vision, what the mission is. And when I graduated Columbia, I started another business, also in construction, a nanotech business in the construction space, and it's amazing. Those ideas were the furthest thing from my mind, and shame on Columbia. But now, after like having gone through it a second time, it's like I realize how important that is, and it's really in developing the culture. So as a company scales, these values, principles don't get lost, and making it clear to the organization, the people. It's so important, especially the early hires of an organization, that they match those values. So, like, we're a mission-driven organization. Our decisions are very fundamentally thinking about, is this good for the environment? Is this good for society? And when those decisions as leadership kind of move down throughout the whole organization, and you're hiring with that in mind, you're having those conversations at the interviewing level, at the reference check level, and then making sure there's really that tight connection, it's less likely to lose your way. You can't force a culture, but you could certainly guide it. And then this is where, as a leader, the decision. So we're expanding to D.C., to Atlanta, to another place in New Jersey, making sure that we're connecting at the city level, at the community level. In Newark, we're working with like the Ironbound Community Center on the hiring side, making sure we're working, engaging the community so they understand what we're doing, what's important to them, reaching out to community leaders, food deserts, whatever it is. But it all starts with the culture and the values that we're setting at our organizations.
I hope to scale my business, and I hope to grow the business significantly. And I agree with what you're saying, which is that you have to set certain criteria at the beginning, and this is why we decided to be certified organic, and that we made a commitment to being certified organic, because it just seemed like it was going to be too easy to lose our way if we weren't certified organic. It's an investment, but it also helps us stay true to our values. And we know that if we're purchasing all certified organic ingredients, there are checkpoints all along the way to ensuring that there's a certain level of quality, environmental stewardship, animal welfare that is being that the ingredients are being held to, and I don't have to, go and inspect every single farm. I don't have to, this is a stamp that helps ensure that. So I guess I'm just echoing what you're saying, which is if you set it up in the beginning and you have certain criteria and you don't waver on that, then you can scale within those that framework that you set up in the beginning.
One of the things I think about too in it is, in what way does scaling up benefit the goals and the values that I previously set? That it's not just, I want to get big because there's going to be, the opportunity for more profit, but in what way have I advanced some of the other values so that when we took on a second restaurant, we were able to say, I'm committing to a certain amount of space to be able to break down whole animals rather than being beholden to buying box beef or that allowed us to have real access to a group of producers that otherwise I wouldn't. That is more difficult and more challenging in a small restaurant to have access to. So that the growth let us take on yet another deeper level of our commitment to purchasing in certain ways. So that's always what we're looking at. I mean, when I think about the third restaurant, what I think is that I'll get to have the handyman as a full-time employee. That's maintaining the workplace, because that's always a struggle where we beat up our infrastructure, and you're always trying to outsource that to find somebody. And I want every manager to know how to throw a circuit breaker and change a washer on a sink. But in fact, what I really want is somebody whose job is to go around and make sure that the stairs are in good shape and the lights are all fixed and all that. So that's how scaling up advances the cause.
I'm doing that right now. I'm hiring someone right now that I'm have found through the Southwest Brooklyn Business Development Corporation, and or whatever they're called, and they are helping connect me with community members that need jobs. And I'm very proud to say I'm able to add another full-time employee because we are growing, and in that exact role, by the way.
I just add a comment about I think that part of business planning is for you all is really this question of scale and upward pressure to cash out to a vertically integrated holding company that has pieces all over the world. One of the interesting things about Ben and Jerry is that they negotiated this incredible deal where Unilever has to give them a percentage of the profit that they then give out through the employees to grassroots social justice work around the country. So I think that I'm really serious about this, that you have to begin to think about this. Where is the business going if you're hugely successful and you're working, 85, 90-hour weeks for 7 or 8 years to get it to that place? At some point, we are all like, oh, we'd like to have a longer vacation in the Caribbean, right? So around questions of ownership models, around questions of how could the business remain more sustainable and local and equitable, like those are the things to think about now, not when you have somebody knocking at the door from, Mexico's largest holding company that wants to buy your artisanal bread business, and it's going to completely change the culture of your company and how your employees are treated, and it's going to feed the beast again.
On the scale-up side, Peter just made a good point. It's when, as we scale up, it enables us to do a lot more locally, especially on the technology, on the purchasing side, where you have bigger economies of scale. If we're trying to innovate a way to reduce water consumption or to have higher nutritional density or whatever it is, the more gross profit we have, the more we could funnel into research and development on the engineering, on the horticulture, on the data science side. So one definitely has something to do with the other. When you think of Unilever, it doesn't come unless Paul Pullman, the CEO of Unilever, really at the top down kind of sets these buying standards of what their purchasing department's going to do, what sort of products they're going to sell. So whether it's a small company or a huge multinational, the values and the cultures really have a big way of pushing behavior that make it relevant locally, as well as setting new standards and then really driving behavior. The big guys, like the Walmarts of the world, can change the dial so much more impactful than us smaller players can.
By some strange coincidence, I was on a panel with Unilever executives 2 weeks ago talking about investing in sustainable local food, and it was a bit like surreal, but they seemed enthusiastic, if not completely convinced. On the notion of the impact on the bottom line, let's talk a little bit about that. In Hugh's work, he's spoken about how he's using philanthropy to fund organizing that demands or requests or implores owners to accept a different bottom line in favor of treating workers better or the environment more sensitively, like in the case of brand workers. On the flip side, you as business people have to go to investors, a different, and convince them that the change in the bottom line is due to your commitment to a different way of doing business. How do you make those choices, and how do you describe those choices to people who are been educated in the world of hockey sticks and scalable enterprises, and convince them that your business will be viable in a competitive context? How do you convince? How do you fund a group that would then go out and have these business owners push back and say, I can't do this because it's a competitive context in which I will suffer if I behave in this credible or ethical way that you've asked me to do? How do you make the case for that in those two scenarios, and how would someone making the choice for forming their own business absorb that into their business model?
So, given there might be impact investors or soon-to-be impact investors in the room, I think this undercovers a gap in financing, which is, I personally believe people use the word impact investors and they cloud it. So you hear people say, I'm an impact investor, but my return expectations are no different from other market forces. I don't buy those people are impact investors. If that's the case, they're not needed. The market will solve whatever problem they're going after. An impact investor is trying to bridge a gap between what the regular markets will do and what's not happening. So, and that gap is where maybe it's a reduced return on equity that they're willing to take on to go to an investment. They're true impact investors. They're out there. They can be found, and they want to do great things. And certainly, I applaud those efforts. And I think the community should kind of call out, if they agree with that sort of distinction, call out what an impact investor is and what it's not. From AeroFarms' standpoint, to attract capital, and there's a capital intensity, like our limitations to scale is capital. These are $20 million projects here and there that we're putting together, and it's people like Goldman Sachs. So when Goldman Sachs, for example, comes in and provides us a loan, it's from Alicia Glenn's group, the Urban Investment Group, that has a different lens. And Goldman wants to make money, and they should make money, but there's an argument to say that their return profile, given the risks of this venture, is below market of what a project could otherwise get. Maybe not. I'm not to say, but I think their lens is, in doing a deal, is what's the social benefit, what's the environmental benefit, and that, to me, is impact investing. I mean, we've certainly had to make the case for capital of here's, in just regular business case, here's the money we're going to go in, and here's the returns that you're going to expect, and it had to be compelling. And we had to make it a compasement for equity investors that this is the scale in the industry we're going to achieve, and this is how we're going to achieve scale, and it has to be compelling. But when whether it's debt or equity providers out there that are willing to fill a gap, it changed the world, and it really can catalyze new businesses, new industries.
I make the argument for marketing. We have received a very high percentage of our media attention through our work with our nonprofit and our being sort of recognized as a social business. And a case in point is I was asked to be on a segment the other day on MSNBC with Tamron Hall called Born in the USA. And I watched a couple of previous segments. Oh, this is cool. This is going to be a feature about our business, being born in Brooklyn and our business, whatever. Because so many of the features that are about us are about our Blue Marble Dreams, our nonprofit, which is amazing. But as CEO of the actual Blue Marble Ice Cream, my directive is to grow my business and continue to have healthy whatever. So I thought, this is awesome. And I sat and immediately I realized it was about our being a social business. That was the story. That was what they wanted to tell. And so I welcome it. I love it. It's great. But I think that's the marketing that we're getting, and we're getting it for free. And I would say to investors, we have this built-in kind of marketing platform to sell our company as to consumers because of the good work that we're doing. And I went and watched it afterwards, and I saw Blue Marble ice cream, social business. That's the story they want to tell. So I think it's attractive in that way and sellable in that way. And also, we being the only certified organic ice cream in New York City, there are other certified organic ice cream pints. They're from the West Coast. There's some from smaller companies from on the East Coast, but not a lot. And for buyers at the retail level, it's a huge draw for our company. So I think that both of those things would be what I would say. Does that make sense?
So one could say that your commitment to running a social and environmental business is that your business is a hybrid. Let's say it's a hybrid between a business model and a charitable model. How do you, I'll flip the question around, is how do you make sure that you're servicing the bottom line without letting the charitable purposes or the sort of non-business purposes take over and engulf your business?
I have a business partner. That is a huge challenge for us, or for me, because I have a commitment all the time to bringing great new product into the restaurant, but I have to be able to turn it around at a price that makes the bottom line work, and or how many people are working in the restaurant based on the amount of business that we're doing. So really, my business partner is there to continually talk to me about that aspect of the model and finding the balance. It takes me back, 2 questions back a little bit, and I mentioned that the idea of a third restaurant, but at the end of the day, there's a place that growth isn't necessarily the right thing to do, or the assumed thing to do. If I run a business that's employing 30 or 40 people, and it's a good work environment, and there's good food, and other goals that I've set, isn't that enough? Isn't that enough for having achieved a set of values and an impact on the community? And I think that it's important to go back to that sometimes. That scale isn't everything. Scale isn't going to solve all the problems. In fact, scaling up, as Hugh has talked about, and we know, scaling up creates a lot of the problems that we have. And so that I that's the other place where I am, is that between fighting that the values and the bottom line is that maybe scaling up isn't the answer.
There's an awesome book about one person's entrepreneur story who did not scale up. It's called My Beautiful Business by Judy Judy Wicks. And it's about the White Dog Cafe. Yeah. I read it, but now Philly. I can't remember anything. Anyway, I really recommend the book. It's very inspiring. And she's someone who did not really scale My Beautiful Business.
On the macro decision-making standpoint, it's easy. On the specific decisions, it's hard. What I mean by that is, if the business doesn't make money, then it's not going to scale. If the business is good for environment, good for society, it needs to scale. One of my other hats, I co-chair the Circular Economy Task Force for the World Economic Forum, and we're trying to kind of put companies that have a benefit for the environment kind of in front of the mic so they could showcase the Unilevers and others of the world to go faster. That doesn't happen if the businesses don't make money. On the specific so therefore, that's being profitable is one of our founding missions. One of them. That said, on the specific decision side, it's hard. So can you pay someone more? Can you be a better steward? Can you open up another farm in a school? Can you do all these decisions? Can you offer better benefits? I mean, the answers to all these are yes. And you have to use business judgment to understand, when to do what, where to do what, when. And that's where it always gets harder. But having that foundation of we need to make money in order to scale makes it easier because you're doing the right thing by showing others, your business and others, the way.
I just also want to put in a quick plug that it doesn't necessarily have to be about your business. There's all kinds of interesting stuff happening. So in my world of grassroots progressive organizing and movement building, there is an increasing understanding, and the Nation did a great issue a couple years ago about entrepreneurism on the left. It's no end of frustration on my part that some of my colleagues don't want to think in an entrepreneurial way. It makes me a little nutty. But I think there's also options for those of you in the room who understand that there's beginning to be an increased understanding that the kind of mythic entrepreneur, Walt Disney, Steve Jobs, all this kind of stuff, like that's ultimately not going to save the planet. What's going to save the planet is modes of collective ownership where the decision is not like, oh, we can take this step with the business and that will mean there's going to be this byproduct, or, oh, we're going to have to cut wages. There's work going on in the community land trust space amongst homeless organizations. Picture the Homeless, one of our grantees here in New York City, is trying to figure out a way to adapt some of the models that have worked in rural areas and in the countryside into cities to help people who are really, are stuck in the shelter system or stuck in generational poverty. So I think there's also the possibility of unleashing your entrepreneurism and creative energy in ways with community institutions that are increasingly understanding that, yes, we have to push against things that disenfranchise people or pollute the planet, but we can also pull things into communities in new ways and interesting ways that are about collective ownership, not in like Moscow in 1925, but rather, the United States, Europe, Malaysia, name the country. There's ways that we can build new institutions that do contain and hold the social venture entrepreneurial spirit, but are also more clearly grounded in recreating the commons in a way that works for more people. So I just want to make that plug of like, it doesn't just have to be about your business and you being successful defined in those traditional capitalist terms.
That's great. Well, I agree with Hugh that it's about aligning yourself to a movement and defining that movement in some coherent way where you can make change with others. And make collaborations across different platforms where you see change makers with whom you identify. One thing I would say, I just want to draw out one idea. If we have people here who are considering starting a business or considering investing in a business, what was the single sort of guiding light principle that launched you into what you're doing? If you have the sort of one thing that you remind yourself about for your business, was there a single first step that got you to do business in a different way? Could you describe that, the kind of the key understanding that unlocked this different way of seeing business? And then similarly for Hugh, is what would you say from your perspective would be a key understanding to bring to a business in order to have it perform according to social and environmental standards as opposed to purely just profit? So key understanding that led you to do what you do and guides you to continue to do what you do.
I think I try to envision the world that I want to live in and make decisions as if I were living in that world.
I would say the clear understanding of what problem I want to solve and having extreme focus of solving that problem at the place where I'm most likely to succeed. So for example, wanting to solve water, I got into agriculture. Looking at the trends in agriculture, I saw other problems in waste. and then understanding where I'd most likely to succeed was leafy greens. Then building a team to focus on technologies that would be successful in the areas of local food production at leafy greens to help solve water. Just knowing where to jump in is key.
I guess for me, it was and still is, like what Jenny was saying, that it's sort of about the joy of making wonderful food, making people happy with a great meal, with a great dining experience around the table, and that is always driving all the decisions that we make in the business is a great taste and a great meal.
I would just say quickly I feel like these three folks are folks who are doing it right from what I've heard. I would just say, again, this notion of high road, and high road doesn't just mean that you source locally or that you're organic, that you're really looking behind the curtain and asking what is the status of workers in the people that I procure from, or what is the status of workers in the industry that I'm in, and really develop this notion of the high road if you're going to go the more conventional, or I don't want to say conventional because that's kind of an obnoxious word because you guys aren't conventional, but if it's about you and your business, that high road concept is really important. If it's about you being part of a community, unfortunately, as much as I totally hear what Jenny is saying, I try to make choices as if I'm living in the world I want to live in, but I know from what I see every day in my job working with disenfranchised communities, there's a lot of ugliness in the world. And what is your responsibility as somebody who's building a sustainable business or otherwise to dealing with that disenfranchisement? Because the market is not going to save us. Like that is a chimera. That is unrealistic. There's no such thing as a free market. Adam Smith said it. So what is your responsibility to embrace that reality and be part of a movement that is about entrepreneurism and generating profit to meet our needs, but also not wrecking the planet or sacrificing too many communities in the process?
So everybody who invests in alternative investments, impact investments, is always concerned about metrics. With a profit-making business, you can measure your success easily by, is the bottom line, am I profitable, am I not profitable, am I making money, am I not making money? How do each of you measure your success for the environmental and social causes or aspects of your business? And then similarly, Hugh, how do you evaluate the funding that you do with specific metrics? I'm sure there's many, but if we could boil them down to one or two key metrics that are the most sensible that you use on a regular basis, rather than a long checklist, so to speak. Or if there is a long checklist, to let us know about that. But what are the metrics that you use to gauge your success along social and environmental lines?
Well, the B Corp has a very long checklist, which is a great frame of reference. Is that the term? I don't know. That's the general checklist. But how diverse is your employee pool? How are you paying people? Are you offering health benefits? Those are the worker things. And then for me, the organic is the standard I have for my sourcing. And are people happy that work for me? That's kind of important. How do I that's important. There's all sorts of other things I can't think, but I don't know. Someone else go. There's so much. It's so constant. It's just.
Jenny, do you track it the same way you track profits, or is it just a gut thing?
That's the thing. I don't yet, but because we're applying for B Corp, then once again, it's like with the organic thing. Okay, the B Corp people, this is what they do. They can make sure that I'm whatever, and we can go through the checklist and that. But as a small business owner, just trying to do everything, it's like you go with your gut. And
Can you explain briefly B Corp for those that might not
you
understand?
explain B Corp.
All right. All right. Well, B Corp is an assessment tool that is promulgated by an entity called blab.org in an effort to provide a very complete assessment of social and environmental commitment by businesses. It provides a preliminary assessment by which we, as foodshed investors, evaluate the bona fides of companies that come before us and say they're sustainable. And it also provides, when you're certified, which is a longer and more durable process, that you have you reach a score similar to like a LEED certification score for in a green building, about how committed you are to those things. And it's a range, and it allows businesses to then move up a scale so they can measure themselves against that scale. And then on the flip side, there's an evaluation system that they use for those businesses called the GIRS, the acronym of which I'm not going to attempt to remember. But it is an attempt to create a metric system, but it is quite complicated, very worthwhile, but sometimes challenging for small businesses to push all the way to the end. But that it does represent, by the way, a movement of businesses joining that, and they just, I think, peaked over 1,000 earlier this year, 1,000 businesses that are B Corp certified. But let's get back to the sort of the metrics by which you run your business and how you may evaluate them.
Well, the thing I was going to say about it is that part of what I look at is like, have I advanced from where I was a year ago? Where there's, you could. There's so many ingredients that come into the restaurant, some of which are still commodified products, and sort of still need to be. So it's just like, where can we keep shining the light and say, can we take this next step? So that's always one of the challenges, one of the goals of the business is to keep that moving along. So it doesn't. There's no metric for it, but it is. What do we want to look at next? Have we gone there? And the same thing is sort of in on the employee side. It's just like, have I been able to move something further forward down the field than where I was, as I said, a year ago or previously? So we are in a competitive environment. We are, and we're in a. Not only is it a competitive environment, but restaurants are all about. Not all of them, obviously, but the model is about cheap food, and so it's not just that the competition is lots of people doing what you're doing, but how do you do it a little bit better? But it's just like going in the complete opposite direction and not serving cheap food, because of what cheap food means in terms of who grew it, what they were paid, what the state of the land is after the fact. So those are hard to take on, but we keep at it to say, what do we have to share with people?
So we're on the B Corp side. We just found out that we could be an LLC and still be a B Corp. So we just had a conversation with them this week, and look forward to continuing that process. On the goals side, we're a very data-driven organization, so we track a million different things like energy, water, waste, nutrition, and it's like within nutrition, it's nutrition per caloric intake, a host of different items. If on the productivity side, I'd probably boil it down to energy, water, waste. On the social side, we love what this farm in a school has done, and in kind of educating kids about childhood nutrition, and we're trying to figure out on the business side how we could scale it up. So we are, if there's anyone that's interested in joining that journey and figuring it out, happy to collaborate, and that's going to be a metric that we follow more closely.
I just want to say a quick word before Hugh answers about timing. I know you hear there's hubbub on the side of the wall. Since we started late, can I get a consensus that we'll go over, because I want to leave time for audience questions? Is everyone comfortable with that? We'll maybe go 5-10 minutes over and then head to lunch. So I just want to warn you that that's the anticipated outcome. But next we'll go to if you have a thought about the metrics you use to evaluate food businesses particularly.
To the extent that we have so we have about $5 or $6 million in assets under management, and some of our donors are they're aging, and they don't want to talk to me twice a year about what their gift size is going to be. So we're talking about endowment gifts. Oh, sorry, yeah. So we have a small amount of money, assets under management, and we're trying to walk the talk of how we use our endowment as a model for other foundations, because endowments trustees are notoriously, it's changing. I mean, there's many, many more foundations. Just for context, a foundation in the United States is expected to pay a 5% payout from their corpus every year. So whatever they kick off, they pay their staff, they make their grants. And there's some foundations that, like the F.B. Heron Foundation, that have moved fully into the impact investing space. Some 80% of their endowment is now going out as subsidized loans, no interest loans, PRIs, some market rate stuff. For us, we looked at a number of different things. There's a company called Co-Packers in Kingston. It's a really smart group of guys who took over. It's a former IBM manufacturing facility. They made chips or something for computers. And IBM sold it off and left it. So there's this corporate industrial kind of kitchen, and these guys grabbed it, and they do fresh, frozen, they package the goods of sustainable, natural, and organic farmers in the Hudson Valley. It's a really cool project. My Treasury Committee my Finance Committee ultimately said we won't be able to get any money out of this for too long a time, and we need to understand more things about the business model. So a couple of my board members are actually working now with co-packers to figure out what would be an investment vehicle for smaller foundations like us. The other one we have, a really smart guy by the name of Mark Reed, has something called the Contact Fund, which is an LLC. It's like a plug. So what he did is he went to a bunch of donors and other foundations and said, look, he's a inheritor of himself, and he took his money and started this fund, which is now part of Sea Change Capital Partners, because he doesn't want to build an organization along with it himself. But he wants to keep making the money available to affordable housing construction. There's a couple charter schools, which is controversial for our crowd, but there's a number of things that Contact has done in the kind of supporting transitional rec centers space, creating community amenities that are structured as deals. So we got, our return on that, we just took two $25,000 notes a couple years ago. We got more than we got from our corporate bonds, which were at like 0%. So it was more money than we would have made in some of our fixed asset classes. So for us, I think the other thing that I'm really trying, because we're a smaller player relative to some of the other foundations involved with community food funders, is really this notion. What I want to really see happen is how we understand patient capital in terms of race, class, and gender in particular, because there are a set of gaps and challenges, whether they're digital gaps, whether they're access to capital, whether it's kind of social relationships that you guys have that people in poor communities just don't have, right? And so how do we create pools of capital? Because the thing you hear in the food space all the time amongst both investors and foundations is, these things aren't deal ready. And like, we're going to be, it's like the long term in your world. We're all going to be dead if we don't figure out how to make more deal ready stuff. So I'm really hoping to see more of a focus on like black women entrepreneurs who would be willing to put in capital and provide the kind of mentoring, assistance, advice, because there's a bunch of urban gardeners around the city that would love to be growing in more of a business mode, in addition to the stuff that they're doing around culture and political education. Community gardens have always been a site of political, cultural, and kind of community renewal in this town. And it's going to be different for different kinds of entrepreneurs. So we're looking for other opportunities like that. And there are RSF Social Finance has some cool funds that it's not a huge return, but it's finding businesses and it's staying consistent around businesses that they want to make capital accessible to, that are thinking about some of these questions. So some of this stuff is really starting to happen. You have to dig for it sometimes.
I would say make a quick plug to dovetail off of what Hugh said before we go to questions. Food and Enterprise, which I mentioned earlier, we founded it with a consortium of about 80 partners, including community food funders, from the realization that foundations and investors looking to place capital in sustainable food and farm businesses found that the investor-ready problem or the funding-ready problem could be solved through creating strategic alliances with consultants who understood how to help those businesses take the steps towards making their businesses more viable, accountants, biz dev, marketing. And so this conference is a very unusual, unsiloed space where we try to create relationships more than we try to just share panel-based education. And so if that's something interesting to any of you, please check it out or speak to me later. But now I'd like to open to the floor to questions. Question in the front? I'll repeat the question.
I do have a microphone if they need it. I do have a microphone.
What's that? Oh, that's a great idea. The question was, could we get a show of hands of what constituencies or stakeholders we have in the room? So who considers himself an impact investor in the room? Great. Who considers himself a consultant or an impact consultant? Who represents the nonprofit sector? Who represents a social entrepreneur? Who represents a traditional financial institution? Who represents traditional food or other enterprise or entrepreneur not in the social space? Am I missing anybody? What's that? Students. And how about government? Great. Well, that's a pretty diverse crowd. That's exciting. Thank you for that. That's a great showing. Any other questions? In the back?
Where am I here?
So I was wondering, what type of trends do you see in terms of the global scenery? Let's talk about kind of, we live in a global world, and then as we shift towards local consumption, how are we thinking about those countries that depend on agriculture, and also how what is being exported to those countries is the bad practices and not the good practices that you guys are talking about. So how are we shifting the view towards everybody else outside to just make sure that we don't have to solve those problems in the future, but that we actually avoid from those practices to start being in other countries?
When you say countries that are dependent on agriculture, would you include the United States with its second largest export product being agriculture? I guess we'd have to include it. But yes, great question.
Happy. So I co-chair the Technology and Innovation Group of Agriculture at the World Economic Forum, and a lot of the focus there is on poorer countries. And from an innovation standpoint, the way I guess we in our group, and we work with a lot of NGOs and policymakers, are trying to address farming habits, is providing technologies that make sense today. A lot of digitalization, like handhelds. A lot of people have handhelds, and that is allowing cooperatives to come together and to have more purchase power and better line of sight in terms of how to sell products. So there's a way technology and innovation, it can change the small farmer. There's unfortunately like this triangle void where the innovators are often the small companies. The small companies often aren't good at transporting technology to poor areas of the world, and then you have this and the bigger companies aren't as good as innovating. So you're in this void where a lot of technology doesn't run to the poorer areas of the world. What needs to be appreciated is it's very rare. If you look at adoption, and this is we have the technology lens as a technology enthusiast, but when you look at adoption curves, it's very rare that technologies jump from Silicon Valley to poor areas of the world. If you take solar, for example, you have early adopters, US, Germany, then you get economies of scale, then it brings down the cost structure, you get manufacturing in China, and then these technologies get to go in smaller parts of the world. So actually treating these problems in the US, in industrialized countries or richer countries that could bring innovation and take on the earlier capital cost, gets the poorer countries of the world the problems. It may not be tomorrow, it may be a few years out, but it's all interrelated. So the short-term solution is incrementalism coupled with transformationalism. So what are, like the digital example I gave is how do you empower new innovations that are already available to bring whether small farmers together in ways that add value, coupled with continuing to do things that push the bigger, more transformational leaps in technology.
So from my perspective, I spent 10 years working on some post-Green Revolution projects in West and Southern Africa as a Peace Corps volunteer, and then for UNICEF, and then for a couple local people's organizations. Unfortunately, a lot of what you're describing has been happening for 15 and 20 years. Large global corporations, there's a land grab going on in places like Mali and Southern Africa and Latin America and Asia. So for me, again, to put in a plug to use whatever philanthropic dollars you have to fund institutions like Via Campesina. There's some African Farmers Union, Wangari Maathai, that won the Nobel Prize a few years ago, and her community forestry movement, which is basically to try and take on corrupt national governments that are often operating at the behest of global corporations, and the extractive stuff that they do, where the civil and political infrastructure at the community level is not there to take on some of these forces, because they're big, they're capitalized, they're about things like diamonds and energy, and now, unfortunately, about agriculture, too. So I think for me, the other thing we really have to be careful of in the West is this idea that somehow we got it right and now it's bringing it to the global South. There's actually, from hijos in Mexico, like a lot of the workers on farms in New Jersey, the mushroom farms, and in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and other places, they come from places that were the management institutions for land and resources are 2,000 and 3,000 years old, right? Like, these folks know how to do it. So part of our responsibility is to go and learn from those folks too. The women rice farmers that I worked with during the Green Revolution, the French and then the Taiwanese advisors and then Red Chinese advisors went over the course of 15, 20 years and brought in men and machines and fertilizer and all this stuff and boost yields, and then the machines broke and there was no infrastructure to fix them. The advisors left, the credit dried up, and the women wanted to know what happened to them, and it went back to women farming rice as they had farmed for, like 700 years in the area that I lived in. So there was a very smart Senegalese rice advisor that we worked with named Alphonse Faye with Winrock International, where we went into the farm system as it was and tried to figure out simpler ways to boost yields, and it ultimately worked. So I think some of it is being careful that the solutions are already there. It's about how capital moves and how you play a role in moving that capital in ways that are more sustainable and actually empower local communities versus disenfranchise them from their land. Or like this whole issue I was telling Derek, I was on a panel where people were talking about sustainable forestry, and the vehicles that they were talking about were basically capital was going to warlords and military juntas in Southeast Asia to do monoculture tree plantations to feed the IKEA machine. And literally tens of thousands of indigenous people had been turned off their land as a result. So we have to be very, very, very careful about things that, as somebody was saying, profess to be green when in fact they're supporting some really nasty stuff in the world.
That's if I could just say, that's a great example of like people trying to help out in unintended consequences in the middle. So if the main cause of deforestation is palm oil, and all of a sudden you get the Unilevers of the world to say we're not going to buy palm oil from these parts, the Philippines or whatever, these parts of the world where there's massive deforestation, and we want to make sure there's like good forestry stewardship, then at the edges, then it has huge change through the value chain, versus these unintended consequences when you attack it in the middle.
Just real quick, some of what Hugh was talking about made me start thinking about just another reason to beware of GMOs as a non-solution. What he's talking about is, the exportation of our solutions to other places where the solutions may already exist. That's a very, very important aspect to look at in terms of exportation of highly advanced technologies that may or may not be appropriate in the local landscape.
Yeah, I think if, like we were saying, scale can be a problem, efficiency can also be a problem. And you look at what's happening in China, where the average size of the farm is 1.5 acres, and the Chinese government is looking to do the kind of farm consolidation and industrialization that's happened in the United States, and disenfranchise those farmers as a way to modernize is pretty horrific if you think about the results of the same scheme in other places. Yes. Oh, sorry, I missed you. A last question, then we'll go to closing remarks. Thank you all for your patience.
It's difficult to see. Thank you for a great discussion. Very interesting. I'm thinking about taking it down to the macro level, to the micro level again, in terms of value chain. How do you just quick respond to your food waste in your different sectors? What do you do with it?
The question is, how do you deal with food waste in your different sectors? I think David's addressed it in his. Maybe Jenny and Peter can. Oh no, maybe you haven't. Food waste.
We don't have much in our business, and so I don't. Yeah.
But she has her business has all compostable items in the store. So.
So
Value chain.
The folks that we buy from, I don't know. I don't know. That's actually one of the criteria that you're looking into on the B Corp, and it was a really it was something that I have to look into, and I don't have an answer for you on that.
On ours, we utilize our root waste and our stem waste, and we're very much the mantra of like waste equals food. As a member of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation CE 100, we are kind of looking at root waste to go into a product for animals, and our stem waste, we eat it for lunch almost every day and mix it up with other products.
In your value chain, David, do you have a sense of that, or is it for you? It's
our
not?
value chain are nutrients.
Right.
So it's and most of those are they're mined minerals, elements, and then it just comes to us. So there's not waste issues. They're consumed pretty readily. It's not an issue there.
Peter?
Yeah, from the value chain side first, I mean, it seems to me that part of that is our commitment to understanding the businesses of the people we do business with, and that takes time and energy, and is rewarding. And then you learn about your product and what's coming into the restaurant, and then you can make more educated choices about it. So it's not just sort of like hitting the checklists of the B Corp. I mean, it's just like that's part of my commitment, is to go to the farm and see what that operation looks like and learn about farming in a real grassroots kind of way. What comes into our restaurant and what goes out, we have thankfully, the waste haul companies in New York, or ours, has looked to separate and cut costs, and so that there's composted material, and then there's the boxes that get broken down, and so they've embraced that, whether it's for a profit reason or philosophical. It doesn't matter, but it then lets us work with that. But that's as far as that goes in the course of a day.
I would just say quickly, it's a huge issue. And Community Food Funders, we're actually about to do a funder briefing around it called Feeding 5,000. There's a bunch of work going on. I mean, in New York City, we had this Greening Western Queens Fund in Western Queens. There was a blackout in 2006, and kind of tried to say it was 20 customers. Well, one customer was like 45,000 people at Queensbridge Houses in Astoria, which is the largest public housing complex in the country. So we funded a bunch of work out of community benefit restitution funds that came out of some regulatory hearings. And a group, Asian Americans for Equality, we were talking to them about doing a waste oil collection thing. And what we discovered as we were talking about funding this project in the area is there's actually a bunch of companies that collect waste oil. And the other exciting project that we funded, and it's got social enterprise components to it, because it's a group of really young, smart, committed activists. The city has talked forever about doing community-based composting, and you might have heard a couple years ago, Michael Bloomberg before he left office, announced like overnight we're going to move to community-based composting. That's not actually organic composting. That closes the nutrient cycle. It's sent to an incinerator and it's burnt, most of it. And in some cases it can be turned into some kind of crazy products that probably we don't want to keep using. But the point is, we funded a project this group of activists showed in Western Queens using farmers markets and community institutions that you could successfully do community-based composting and make it sustainable through a revenue model. And it was a result of that project that the Department of Sanitation is all excited, because they've been funding like consciousness raising around it for 25 years. But this group of young people that we started with like a $20,000 grant. It went up to about $110,000. They got a larger composter, and now the city's helping them do a facility under the Queensbridge. What's it named now? The Edward I. Koch Bridge. So it's a huge issue, and I would say for a sector that that the solutions are needed and doing it efficiently in interesting ways, I would figure that would be a big piece, because it's the waste stream. Whether you're talking about unsustainable business practices or the future, like what these folks are doing, it's going to be a big issue for all of us.
Well, I want to thank you all. I want to thank the panelists, Jenny, David, Peter, and Hugh. Thank you all for your time and attention. And that's a great way to finish, because it's about the vision to see the change, it's about the vision to fund the change, and then to make it happen. Thank you all.